You have the right to remain silent. No. No, there's been a mistake. My voice cracked on the last word. The deputy already had my wrist, and another officer was emptying my purse across my dead mother's kitchen table. My phone skidded across the surface. Lip gloss rolled under a chair and landed against the baseboard. Through the screen door, two neighbors stood frozen in the drizzle, pretending they weren't watching every second. My brother Nolan stood beside my father with one hand on his shoulder. The posture of a man holding someone else upright. The posture of a grieving hero. She drained the account 3 days after Mom died, Nolan said quietly. He was looking at the deputy, not at me. I didn't want to believe it either. I stopped pulling against the handcuffs. What? The room tilted. My father stood with his eyes fixed somewhere near the floor between us. He wouldn't look at my face. On the counter behind him were the casserole dishes people had dropped off after the funeral. The flowers were already going brown at the edges. My mother had been buried 36 hours ago, and my brother had me arrested before her perfume even left the house. My name is Avery Callahan. I am 28 years old, and until the morning my brother accused me of stealing nearly $250,000 from our father, I believed that blood meant something permanent. The police car pulled out of the driveway while Nolan stood on the porch in the rain holding our father upright like I was a criminal stranger being removed from his property. I looked back through the rain-streaked window. Nolan wasn't sad. He was relieved. A detective slid the bank statements across the table as though the case was already decided, and this was simply a formality. 3 withdrawals. 2 wire transfers. 1 forged authorization form with my signature on the bottom line. Every piece of paper pointed at me. You expect me to believe someone forged all of this? The detective asked. Yes, I said. Because I never touched my father's account. Then he turned his laptop and showed me the security image. A woman in sunglasses entering the bank. My height. My build. Wearing a coat identical to the one hanging in my hallway at home. For one horrible second, a second I am still ashamed of, I almost believed it was me. I walked out on bail 6 hours later to find family members gathered in the car park outside. 3 aunts, 2 cousins. My father's oldest friend from church. Not one person moved toward me. Nolan stepped forward first. His voice was soft, almost gentle. You should have just told me you needed money, he said. I looked at his face carefully. At the precise stillness of it. The complete absence of surprise or confusion or the particular rawness that real shock produces in a person. He had rehearsed this. Every word. Every expression. The soft voice. The sympathetic head tilt. This was not a brother reacting to devastating news about his sister. This was a performance he had been preparing for a long time. I drove straight from the station to my parents' house. My father opened the door only halfway. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The surgery 6 weeks earlier had already taken something from him physically, and the grief on top of it had taken more. His eyes were hollow in a way that made me think of a house after everything has been moved out. Dad, please. Just listen to me for 5 minutes. You stole from me while I was recovering, he whispered. The words hit harder than the handcuffs had. Not because they were louder or angrier. 'Cause they were so quiet. So already decided. I didn't do this. Nolan appeared behind him immediately. He hadn't been visible a second earlier. He had been close enough to the door to hear everything, which meant he had been standing there waiting. You need to leave, Avery. I looked at my brother over my father's shoulder. You're doing this, I said. Not loudly. Just naming it. His expression didn't shift at all. Then my father closed the door. I stood on the porch and heard the lock engage with a small precise click. Across the street, curtains moved in 2 windows. I was visible and exposed, and the story being told about me was already spreading through the neighborhood before I had driven away. This was the first time in my life I understood what it felt like to become the villain in your own family's story. By Friday morning I was suspended from my nursing position pending investigation. By Friday afternoon, The local community gossip page had a post describing me as the daughter who robbed her grieving father. It had 63 comments by the time I saw it. By Friday evening, my boyfriend Tyler came over and sat across from me at the kitchen table with an expression that told me what was coming before he opened his mouth. "Did you do any of it?" he asked. I couldn't answer immediately. Not because I was deciding what to say. Because the shock of being asked by someone who had been in my life for 2 years, someone who had eaten dinner at my mother's table, made the air go out of my chest completely. That silence did more damage than any argument could have. Then he said the worst thing. "Nolan showed me the documents." Not my brother. Nolan. Like he had a separate relationship with him that didn't pass through me first. I told Tyler to go home. When he left, I found an envelope taped to the outside of my apartment door. No return address. Inside was a printed screenshot of an article about felony elder financial abuse. One sentence had been highlighted in yellow. "People who steal from family always get exposed." No signature. No note. Just that sentence, highlighted with enough deliberateness to tell me someone had planned this message carefully and enjoyed sending it. 5. I spread the transaction records across my kitchen table that night and went through every line. Not because I expected to clear my name by myself. Because I needed to understand what I was actually looking at. I had worked in healthcare long enough to read documents carefully and look for the thing that doesn't belong. I found it just past midnight. One of the wire transfers was time-stamped on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I stared at the date and felt something cold and clarifying move through me. I had been in a different state that Tuesday. A mandatory hospital seminar. I had driven 4 hours and checked into a hotel and sat through 2 days of training sessions I still had every receipt and badge for. The timeline was impossible. Someone had made a mistake. Not a large one. Just a sliver. But enough. I called the detective the following morning. He sounded bored before I finished the first sentence. "Your brother already explained that discrepancy," he said. "What discrepancy?" "I'm presenting evidence I was out of state." "He said you gave someone else access." When? No name. No documentation offered. Just Nolan's explanation, provided in advance, and apparently accepted without question. Before he ended the call, the detective said one more thing. "You should seriously consider taking a plea before this gets any uglier for you." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Uglier. I had not even started fighting back yet. My mother's lake house sat an hour outside town. She had kept it for decades as the place where the family slowed down. And in the months before she died, I had driven out there twice a week to sit with her and help with her medication. I went back now to collect more of her things before Nolan could decide what to do with them. Her closet still smelled like lavender lotion. I stood in the doorway for a moment and let the smell be what it was, and then I made myself move. I was reaching under the bottom dresser drawer to check for anything left behind when my fingers touched paper. An envelope. Taped flat against the underside of the drawer. My name was on the front in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a small key and a single handwritten sentence. "Don't let Nolan make decisions alone." I read it 3 times. My mother had trusted Nolan more completely than anyone else in the family. She had relied on him for practical matters and business decisions and the kind of planning that required someone organized and focused. So why, in the last weeks of her life, had she hidden this warning specifically for me? What had she seen? What had she known that she didn't know how to say directly? The key was small and brass with a storage company number stamped into the side. I held it in my palm and thought about the way Nolan had said he didn't want to believe it either. So smoothly. So prepared. The storage facility was 20 miles outside town on a road I had never driven. Unit number matched the key. Inside were stacked boxes of paperwork, old family records, folders from my father's construction company going back 15 years. At first I thought my mother had simply been organizing documents after my father's surgery, keeping records in order the way she always kept everything in order. Then I opened the third box. Tax notices with penalty stamps. Property transfer documents routing assets through company names I didn't recognize. Accounts receiving large transfers with no corresponding invoices. Shell structures moving money in patterns that went nowhere clean. And Nolan's name appearing in authorization fields across dozens of pages. My hands started shaking. This was not a family record archive. This was evidence. Carefully preserved evidence of something that had been happening inside my father's company for years. Financial movements that looked deliberate and calculated and deeply illegal. Millions of dollars. Not missing accidentally. Moved with intention. The key my mother had hidden hadn't been to protect family history. It had been to protect the truth. Then I heard footsteps outside the unit. Blows. Blow. The sound of someone not in any particular hurry because they weren't worried about being seen. I pushed the box closed and stayed still. The man who walked past was middle-aged with a gray jacket and a particular kind of deliberate casualness. He looked at the unit numbers above each door as though checking addresses. But he passed my unit twice and each time his eyes moved to my face and stayed there slightly too long. I locked the unit and left through the side exit. That evening I drove home using 3 different routes, checking the rearview mirror at every turn. A gray SUV stayed behind me the entire way. Not close. Careful. The kind of following that is meant to be noticed just enough to send a message without being provable. When I pulled into my apartment complex, the SUV stopped at the end of the road. Sat there for 30 seconds. Then it pulled away. 5 minutes later my phone rang. Unknown number. A man's voice said 3 words. Stop digging now. Then the call ended. I sat in my dark car in the parking lot and went through what I knew. The bank account withdrawal. The forged signature. A law enforcement officer who had processed the arrest without questioning an impossible timeline. A storage unit full of financial fraud evidence. A man following me home. A warning call from a blocked number. Nolan was not acting alone. And whoever was helping him was frightened enough to make that call. Which meant I was closer than they wanted me to be. A retired bank compliance officer named Evelyn agreed to meet me after I mailed her copies of the authorization forms. She had worked in banking for 30 years and she had the particular directness of someone who has spent decades watching people try to disguise dishonesty as paperwork. She looked at the documents for 4 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "These were pushed through manually. Someone bypassed the standard verification queue." "By who?" She pressed her lips together. She set the documents down and looked at the window instead of at me. Then she said a name. Deputy Officer Reed Lawson. The same officer who had signed off on the chain of evidence in my case. I sat very still. A law enforcement officer had been involved in processing the fraudulent bank authorizations. The same officer who had then helped build the criminal case against me. The arrest hadn't been Nolan working alone and hoping it held together. Someone with access to law enforcement systems had helped construct it. My arrest hadn't just been a family setup. It had been engineered from multiple directions simultaneously. I thanked Evelyn and drove home slowly, thinking about Nolan standing on the porch looking relieved while the police car pulled away. He had known exactly what he was setting in motion. Nolan arrived at my apartment on a Wednesday afternoon carrying grocery bags. Not in a hostile way. In the particular way of a brother performing concern for anyone who might be watching from the street. He set the bags on my kitchen counter and stood there looking around my apartment as if taking inventory. "I can make this easier," he said. "You framed me," I said. "No." His voice was patient. "I protected this family." Then he told me what easier looked like. Accept a plea on a reduced charge. Leave town quietly. Sign a document waiving any future claim to company assets or estate decisions. In return, he would persuade our father not to pursue a separate civil suit against me. He said it with the calm of a businessman presenting terms. I looked at my brother and understood something for the first time. This was not about protecting our father. Our father was a prop in this. The grieving, recovering man beside the door. The face that made the accusation land. This was about the commercial land deal. Whatever my mother had arranged. Whatever those storage unit records contained. He needed me eliminated before I understood what I had access to. I told him no. I said it simply and without anger. For the first time in all of this, Nolan's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes that I had not seen there before. He was nervous. Tyler came back 3 days later. He stood in my doorway looking genuinely sorry and said he wanted to fix things. I let him in because I was tired and because some part of me still wanted to believe the 2 years we had spent together had built something real. He sat at the kitchen table and apologized for asking whether I had done it. He apologized for the silence that followed. Then, halfway through the apology, he said the thing that ended everything. He admitted Nolan had been paying his overdue business debts for several months. Not since the arrest. Before it. The apartment went quiet. He offered to help me out when I was struggling, Tyler said. He still couldn't look directly at me. I didn't know what he was planning. But you kept taking the money, I said. He didn't answer. I asked him to leave. He gathered his jacket slowly and stood at the door for a moment. You don't know how far your brother will go, he said quietly. It was the most honest thing he had said all evening. It didn't make me feel better about him. But it told me something useful. Tyler was frightened. Not of Nolan exactly. Of something Nolan had access to. Something Tyler had seen enough of to know the edges of. Whatever Nolan was protecting, it was large enough that he had been buying loyalty in advance. My mother's estate attorney agreed to meet me privately after I explained the situation in careful, factual terms over the phone. He had known my mother for 12 years. He had handled her documents with the kind of care that people give to things they understand are important. He slid a set of amended estate documents across the desk without preamble. 3 months before she died, my mother had transferred controlling authority over a commercial land development deal to me. Specifically and solely to me. The project was in the late stages of county approval, and once completed would be worth several $1 million. She had not told Nolan. She had not told my father. She had done it quietly, with a date that predated her final hospitalization, and she had left the documents with the attorney under instructions not to release them until after the estate process formally began. I sat with what this meant. The storage unit records showed Nolan had been moving money through the family company for years. The commercial land deal was the largest single asset connected to that company. If I held controlling authority over it, I could call for an independent audit at any time. Nolan hadn't framed me because he was angry. He had framed me because he needed me legally compromised before I discovered what that land deal contained. He had done it out of desperation. And desperate people, I was learning, made sloppy mistakes. The campaign against my credibility intensified in the weeks that followed. Anonymous complaints reached the nursing board suggesting I had diverted medication at work. The complaints were vague and unverifiable but sufficient to extend my suspension. Old acquaintances posted online about people finally being exposed without naming me directly. My car was keyed in the hospital car park on a Thursday night. The word scraped into the paint was one word. Traitor. But the strategy had shifted. Nolan wasn't making direct moves anymore. He was letting the environment do the work. The arrest had seeded enough doubt that the community was now sustaining the pressure independently. He didn't need to act. He only needed to wait. I recognized the pattern because I had watched it long enough to see its shape. He wanted me emotionally exhausted. He wanted the financial strain and the professional suspension and the social isolation to compound until surrender felt like relief. I sat in my dark apartment on a Friday night and thought about that. Then I opened my laptop. I created a single document and started cataloging everything I had. Every receipt. Every record. Every timestamp. Every contradiction. The storage unit documents. Evelyn's account. The follow car. The warning call. Each item got its own line. I worked until 3 in the morning, and when I looked at the document, what I saw was not a list of grievances. It was a case. My lawyer helped me obtain the official evidence log through the formal disclosure process. I went through it line by line the evening it arrived. One signature stopped me. Detective Colin Mercer had logged the forged bank authorization forms as collected on a Tuesday morning, signed and time-stamped, except the forms had already been entered into the system by Monday afternoon. Someone had added his name to the collection record after the fact. Not a large change. Just enough to give the chain of custody a credible appearance. I drove to Mercer's office the following morning. He didn't invite me in. We stood in the corridor outside his door. "You built this case before the evidence existed," I said. His face darkened. Not with guilt exactly. With the particular irritation of someone who has been careful and is annoyed to discover they weren't careful enough. "You need to stop before you make things worse for yourself. Not you're wrong. Not, that's not what happened. Before things get worse." The word before. Present and ongoing. As though things getting worse was not a consequence I had caused but a process already underway that I could still choose to step out of. Then he added something in a lower voice. "You have no idea who your brother is protecting. Not what he built. Not what he did. Who he is protecting." I found my father in his garage on a Saturday morning. He was sitting on a low stool beside the shelving unit near the back wall. In his hands were my mother's gardening gloves. The ones she kept on the hook beside the garage door. Green rubber, worn at the fingertips. He was just holding them. Not crying. Not moving. Just sitting there with his wife's gloves in his hands and the weight of everything on his face. I pulled a second stool close and sat beside him. I did not lead with accusations. I handed him copies of the transaction timeline and the timestamp contradiction. At first he pushed the papers away. Then he looked at them. His hand started trembling on the third page. "Why would he do this?" he said. Not "why did you?" Not "this doesn't make sense." Why would he? The pronoun shifted and I felt it like a change in air pressure. He was beginning to see it. Before I could say anything else, I heard Nolan's truck pull into the driveway. My father's entire body changed. The confusion and the grief snapped back behind something else. Something that looked like a child caught doing something they'd been told not to do. He was afraid of Nolan. He had been afraid of him for longer than this. A forensic accountant named Mr. Brathwaite agreed to review the storage unit records after my lawyer explained the case. He worked through the night and had a preliminary summary by morning. Nolan owed an amount I hadn't prepared myself to hear. Bad private investments made 3 years earlier. Loans from lenders who were not connected to any formal financial institution. Personal debts hidden behind business structures so that they didn't appear in any document my father would ordinarily see. The family company had been losing the capacity to service those debts for 18 months. The commercial land deal my mother had transferred to me was worth enough, once the county approval finalized, to cover everything and leave considerable profit. It was the only asset large enough to solve the problem. With me controlling it, Nolan had no access. With me criminally charged and my legal standing compromised, he could challenge the transfer and claim it had been made under circumstances that should be reviewed. He hadn't framed me out of cruelty. He had framed me because the alternative was losing everything he had spent years hiding. Then Mr. Brathwaite set down his pen and said the thing that stopped my breathing for a second. "There is no way one person built this alone. The shell structures are too clean. Someone with professional financial experience designed this architecture. Nolan had help. Significant help. Someone had built the fraud for him. Nolan's wife was named Camille. She had been part of our family for 6 years and had always existed slightly at the edge of things, watching conversations without quite joining them, agreeing with Nolan so consistently that I had stopped noticing it as a pattern. She approached me outside a grocery store on a Thursday afternoon claiming she wanted peace. She said the family was suffering and that she hoped things could resolve without more damage. I listened without saying much. Then she said it. "You should have signed the agreement when Nolan offered." Agreement. Not plea. Not deal. Not the arrangement his lawyer suggested. Agreement. A word from a specific vocabulary. The vocabulary of something that had been planned and named and had existed as a document before I refused to sign it. She heard herself a half-second after she said it. I watched the recognition move across her face. Then she grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark. "You need to let this go," she said. I looked at her hand on my arm and then at her face. "No," I said. "I really don't." She released my arm and stepped back. And what I saw in her expression in that moment was not anger. It was the specific fear of someone who has just said the wrong thing to the wrong person and is calculating exactly how much damage it might do. The bank had originally told my lawyer that surveillance footage from the day of the disputed withdrawals had been corrupted during a system migration. Then an anonymous package appeared outside my apartment door. A flash drive in a plain padded envelope. No note. No return label. The footage on the drive showed the woman in sunglasses entering the bank branch. The same image the detective had shown me during the interview. The same posture, same coat, same build. But the angle was different. A second camera, positioned near the exit door, caught the woman turning sideways as she left. On her left wrist, just below the cuff of the coat, was a tattoo. A small geometric pattern in dark ink. I had seen that tattoo at every family gathering for 6 years. Camille had walked into that bank wearing my coat and my sunglasses and had made 3 withdrawals from my father's account while impersonating me. And someone inside the bank had made sure the exit camera footage disappeared from the official evidence file. I sat on my apartment floor with my laptop open and watched the clip 4 times. Then I called my lawyer and told him to clear his morning. Once I shared the footage with my legal team, Nolan's behavior changed within 48 hours. He stopped presenting as the composed, steady grieving brother. He started making calls. I know this because Camille began leaving the house at odd hours and taking calls in her car in the driveway, which their neighbor mentioned to a mutual friend who told me. Then I drove to the lake house on a Tuesday afternoon and parked a distance back. The windows were open. 2 voices inside, both raised. I sat in my car and held my phone up. Camille's voice came through clearly. "You said Avery would take the plea." A long silence. Nolan's voice quieter. "You were never supposed to panic." I had the recording. Not a summary. Not a second-hand account. Their voices, their words, their specific language confirming that the plea arrangement was a planned structure, and that Camille's action at the bank was part of a coordinated setup. I sat in the car afterward with my hands on the wheel and felt something I had not felt in months. Not relief. Not victory. Just solid ground. The particular stability of a person who has found the thing they were looking for and knows exactly what to do with it. The gray SUV returned on a Thursday night. It was parked directly behind my car when I came out of my apartment building just after midnight. Reed Lawson was leaning against the driver's side door without his badge visible. He looked tired. The way people look when they have been carrying something heavy and are close to the point where the carrying becomes impossible. "You need to understand something," he said. "A lot of people's livelihoods are connected to the Callahan company." I looked at him. This was all about protecting jobs. It's always about money. He told me the district attorney would be publicly announcing formal charges against me within the week. One final move to bury the narrative deep enough that the evidence I had gathered would have to fight uphill against a public presumption of guilt. Before he got back in the SUV, he leaned forward slightly. "If you go to court right now, you lose," he said. He drove away. I stood in the empty car park in the cold and thought about what he had said. Not the warning part. The fear underneath it. Lawson had come in person without his badge to tell me the case was moving against me. He had done it because he needed me to back down voluntarily. You don't drive to someone's apartment at midnight to threaten them unless you're afraid of what happens if they don't back down. For the first time I smiled. The district attorney held a press conference 2 days later. Cameras. Reporters. My arrest photograph displayed on a large screen behind the podium. The DA described me in language designed for headlines. Calculating opportunist. A daughter who exploited a vulnerable and grieving family. A person who had abused a position of trust. I sat in the back row of the press room and listened to my life being summarized by someone who had never spoken to me. Nolan sat in the 3rd row with his hands folded. His posture was relaxed. He had the quality of a man at a meeting whose agenda has been approved in advance. Then a reporter near the front raised her hand and asked why no independent forensic audit had been conducted before the arrest was made. The DA paused. A second reporter followed. Had the evidence been reviewed by an independent body or only by the initial investigation team? A third asked about the chain of custody on the authorization forms. The room's energy changed in the space of 3 questions. Nolan's posture shifted. Barely. But I was watching carefully. The story he had managed so completely for months was encountering resistance it hadn't been built to handle. The reporters were not accepting the presentation. They were interrogating it. His control over the narrative was slipping. And he knew it. My mother's estate attorney called at 6 in the morning sounding shaken. He had been processing the remaining document files and had found a sealed video file attached to a folder my mother had marked private and not to be opened until formal estate proceedings began. He had opened it. He described what he saw carefully and then sent me the file. My mother sat in the armchair in the lake house living room. She looked exhausted in the specific way of someone whose body is using all available energy just to keep the systems running. But her eyes were completely clear. Her voice was steady. She looked directly at the camera and said, "If anything happens to Avery, it means Nolan found the records." My entire body went cold. She knew. Before she died. She had known Nolan was hiding financial crimes inside the company, and she had suspected he would act to protect himself. Then she said something that made everything larger. She said she feared Nolan had formed a relationship with a private lender connected to a local law enforcement official. She said she had seen a name she recognized in documents on Nolan's desk that she should not have seen. This was not family betrayal anymore. This was a criminal conspiracy involving law enforcement. And my mother had seen it coming before any of us. She had spent her final weeks building the evidence trail that could stop it. The courtroom was full the morning the prosecution formally moved forward. Nolan sat beside the prosecutors with our father. His hand on our father's shoulder again. The same positioning. The same grieving hero posture. Consistent to the end. My attorney stood up when it was time. The first thing he played was my mother's video. The courtroom had been producing the ambient noise of a room full of people. Small movements, paper shuffling, quiet whispers. When my mother's voice came through the speakers and said if anything happens to Avery, it means Nolan found the records. The room went completely silent. Then came the bank footage. Exit camera angle. Camille's wrist. Tattoo. Then the audio recording from outside the lake house window. You said Avery would take the plea. You were never supposed to panic. Nolan's face changed slowly and completely. Not all at once. Layer by layer. The composure came off like something dissolving. Underneath it was not rage or defiance. It was the expression of a person who has run out of room. Reporters were already moving toward the exit with their phones out before my attorney had finished speaking. Nolan turned slowly and looked at me across the courtroom. For the first time in all of this, he looked trapped. Not by me. By the weight of what he had built. Federal investigators arrived at the family company building before sunrise the following morning. Lawson was suspended by noon pending an internal affairs investigation. Detective Mercer stopped appearing at his office, and the department released a statement saying he was on administrative leave. Camille accepted an immunity agreement in exchange for full cooperation and testimony. She confirmed everything. The bank visit. The coat. The sunglasses. Nolan's instructions. The advance payment to Tyler to keep him manageable. The shell accounts and the lenders and the name Lawson. All of it. By evening, every local news station was leading with the same story. A financial fraud scheme inside the Callahan construction company. A false accusation engineered to eliminate a family member before she could access estate documents. A law enforcement connection that had helped construct the case. My phone filled with messages from relatives. Cousins who had stood in the car park outside the station and looked away from me. Aunts who had accepted Nolan's version without asking questions. I read none of them. Then my father arrived at my apartment. He stood in the doorway, and when I opened it, he looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then he covered his face with both hands and his shoulders dropped, and he cried in the way that people cry when they have done something they cannot undo and they finally understand the full weight of it. Not because Nolan had been exposed. Because he had closed the door in my face while a deputy put handcuffs on his daughter. 3 months after that morning in my mother's kitchen, all charges against me were officially dropped. The nursing board reinstated my license with a formal written acknowledgement that the original complaints had been submitted anonymously and without supporting evidence. The hospital that suspended me offered my position back in a public statement. Nolan was indicted on 8 separate counts including financial fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. He was sitting alone in the lake house when federal marshals arrived. Camille had already filed for divorce. The private lenders had retained their own legal counsel and were cooperating with investigators in exchange for reduced exposure. The company that had been in our family for 30 years was placed under court administration pending full audit. My father offered me controlling authority over the estate and the commercial land deal. He sat across from me in my mother's old kitchen and laid the documents on the table where my purse had been emptied and looked at me with an expression that contained every month of this compressed into one look. I sat with it for a long time. Then I told him no. I told him to find good people to manage the estate and to take care of himself. The last time I saw Nolan was at sentencing. He looked at me the way he always had, like he was calculating the best move. Like he expected me to be angry or to want something from the moment. Gave him nothing. I stood up. I walked out of the courtroom into cold morning air. He stayed behind in the room his lies had built. And I finally understood that this was the only ending that had ever mattered. Not punishment. Not money. Not the company or the land or any piece of what he had tried to take. Just the door swinging open and me walking through it free.